Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earliest crimes. But before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. I have some new honeybee stuff. I know I said I wasn't buying more stuff, but I couldn't stand it. This is a Dawn Wolfsagel stamp set. It's Beach Please, and then I have the stencils called Beach Break. I didn't really use the stencils that well, but whatever. We're going to do some watercoloring. I picked up a block of this Canson Monteval watercolor paper. It is a 4x6 inch piece of paper, so I will need to trim it down a little bit. But I'm going to be stamping on it with some Versaclear Nocturne Black ink. I will be using my Magello Mission Gold watercolor palette. My intent is for this card is to have this little beach house sitting, kind of the top 2/3 of the card panel with the ocean at the bottom and the sand in between them. So that top palm tree will get cut off a little bit. And the house and the finished project is still a little closer to the sand than maybe some of the houses really are, but it was exactly the look I was going for. I will be using some white gouache and a stippling brush to create the surf break on the beach. And I think that's all about the coloring. So let's go ahead and get into our crime. So our journey today takes us to the state of New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire was the first colony to separate themselves from Britain and the first territory to have their own constitution, and the 9th colony to ratify the U.S. Constitution, giving the colonies the votes they needed to declare independence from Great Britain. New Hampshire did not have a state flag until 1909. Until then, they used regional flags to represent the state. The first potato planted in the United States was at Londonderry Common Field in 1719. And now the best potatoes in the world are in Idaho. I'm just saying. New Hampshire was the first in 1833 to create a free public library in the United States. New Hampshire is home of the first female strike when 400 mill workers walked out of the Dover Cotton Factory. It did not have its intended effect because they just hired new people to work in the factory. But yes, the first female strike. The first alarm clock was invented in New Hampshire in 1789. New Hampshire has 10 counties, 13 municipalities, 221 towns, and 22 unincorporated places. And New Hampshire is kind of sort of home to the Isles of Shoals. Now, this is a group of islands that actually is situated between Maine and New Hampshire. And these islands have been inhabited for more than 400 years by fishermen and their families. In fact, Smutty Nose Island is one of the islands in the Isles of Shoal, and it is reportedly the place where Blackbeard's ship has wrecked. That was not great English, sorry. Also, Smutty Nose Island is the landing place of one Norwegian fisherman and his extended family, and the place of a winter murderer. So while technically this happens in both New Hampshire and Maine, we're calling it New Hampshire because I thought it was an interesting story. We are going to begin with introducing ourselves to John Christian Hotvent, Hontvet, Hotvet. John was born on February 14th, 1842 in Norway to Christian and Karen Hotvent. John was the oldest of his parents' 11 children. They had 7 boys and 4 girls. Next, we are going to meet Maren Christensen, who was born on November 23rd, 1835, also in Norway, in a place called Larvik, Norway, and her parents were Christian and Edel Christensen. Now, Maren was the youngest of their 4 children, and they had 2 boys and 2 girls. Both John and Maren came to the United States, but when and how is kind of documented differently. Both John and Maren's first U.S. document is actually their marriage registry, and they were married in Boston in 1866. Now, the documentation kind of differs because one account says that they lived in Boston after they were married, but didn't like the size of the city and then moved to New Hampshire to settle into a smaller fishing community. Another source says that John moved to New Hampshire first and started a fishing business after he made enough money to purchase a second ship, moved his wife and his brother to Smutty Nose Island. The problem with that account is that Maren wasn't still in Norway with John's family, so she could not have come across with his brother. But whatever the case, however they got here, John and Maren both ended up in Massachusetts. They met, they fell in love, they got married, and once they decided city life was not for them, they did in fact move to Smutty Nose Island. Now, one thing to mention again is that this group of islands is claimed by, or has been through time, claimed by both Maine and New Hampshire. Smutty Nose was closer to New Hampshire. It was actually part of the state of Maine, but some of the islands were closer to New Hampshire and claimed by New Hampshire at this point in time. So anyway, John fished in the waters off of New Hampshire and out through the ocean. And they made their life on Smutty Nose Island. Now, John's business was going good, like really good. So good, in fact, that he needed to hire another crewman for his fishing ships. He was saving up to purchase a second ship. So enter a man named Louis Wagner. Now, Louis was a 28-year-old Prussian immigrant who, by all accounts, was down on his luck. His previous ways of earning a living had panned out, and he was nearly indigent. John hired Louis to work for room and board. So he wasn't going to be collecting pay, at least not right away. The Hontvits had purchased a duplex on Smutty Nose Island, and they let Louis live in the half that John and Maren and John's brother were not living in at the time. So it was kind of reported that Louis wasn't exactly happy about working for no pay. And I suppose in theory, once they had went out to sea and got the ship, the fish, and come back in, he would have probably been paid. But there was some rumorings that he did not appreciate that working situation, but it was better than going backwards, which was homeless. He was supposedly or reportedly in the rears to his former landlord. He still owed them rent, and he didn't have any money to pay them. So the other downside to this arrangement was actually for John. Louis was often unable to work to rheumatism. Is that arthritis? Louis did mention that he liked having a dry, warm place to live and to sleep, and women who cooked good meals. Now, eventually, John needed more reliable help and was forced to let Louis go. What had happened was that John was able to save up enough money and send back to Norway for Maren's sister Karen and their brother Evan and his new bride Anthe, Anethe. So they needed the other part of the duplex. So Louis was let go. He was, evicted from his home or asked to move out, whatever the case may be. And Maren's sister and brother and sister-in-law moved into the other side of the duplex. So one side had John, Maren, and John's brother, and the other side had Maren's sister Karen, their brother Evan, and his bride Anthe. So here they are living as one big happy extended family in a duplex on Smutty Nose Island, and the men were working together on the fishing schooners. Now we're going to fast forward to March 5th of 1873. So John, his brother Matthew, and brother-in-law Eben took the schooner to Portsmouth, New Hampshire to pick up a shipment of bait that was coming from Boston. However, when they arrived in Portsmouth, they discovered the shipment was delayed. So they did send a message back to Maren. Another fishing boat took a message back to her that they were actually going to spend the night in town and then be back the next day. And while they were in Portsmouth waiting for this bait fish to arrive, they ran into Louis, and they offered him a job helping them with the bait. So they had to get the bait from the bait ship onto their ship so they could go fish and get bigger fish, right? However, when the bait ship finally did arrive, nobody could find Louis. He was like nowhere to be found. And interestingly enough, that night around 8 p.m., a rowboat was reported stolen from Pickering Wharf in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Now, Karen, Maren's sister, had been working at a hotel on Appledore, which is another island in the chain. Appledore could be seen from the tip of Smutty Nose Island, so it wasn't super far away. But with the men not coming home at night, Karen decided she was going to go stay with her sister Maren and their sister-in-law Aneth. And because the night was cold, it's March on the the northeastern coast, and they wanted to kind of be together. It was dark, it was cold, it was gross. So the women ended up staying in one side of the duplex with Maren and Aneth in the downstairs bedroom. And then Karen made a makeshift bed on the floor in the kitchen. I would guess by the fireplace maybe to stay warm. That's the only way I would sleep on a kitchen floor, right? If that was the warmest place in the house. But whatever. At some point during the night, a hinge on the kitchen door creaked as it was being opened, and then the family dog, Ringe, R-I-N-G-E, so Ryan, barked and woke up Karen. Now, Karen thought it was John and her brother and brother-in-law coming back from Portsmouth after all, and whoever was coming into the house was very startled to find someone sleeping in the kitchen. The man who came into the house grabbed a chair and raised it over his head, and then Karen was heard screaming, "John scares me! John scares me!" I'm guessing it was like kind of broken English because they are straight out of Norway, right? So that's just, those were in quotes. That's how it was reported in the newspapers and stuff. So anyway, the man who was scaring her was startled and then began to beat Karen with the chair. And Karen is still thinking it's her brother-in-law, so she's screaming, "John is killing me! John is killing me!" So, of course, Karen's screaming woke up Maren and Aneth, who opened the bedroom door and saw this man, the dark, shadowy form of this man hovering over her sister Karen. And when the bedroom door opened, the man paused for a minute, and that gave Maren just enough time to drag Karen into the bedroom and shut and bolt the door. The intruder then began pounding on the door. Now, Maren was a smart woman, and she knew that that door was not going to hold up to his banging on it for very long. So she actually persuaded Aneth that the only hope they had of getting out alive was to leave through the bedroom window. So Aneth was first through the bedroom window, and she ran but only a few paces, and then she froze in terror because the man had run out of the house. And when he saw her, he grabbed a dull axe that was kept by the door for chopping ice, ran toward Aneth. And as he approached her, Aneth thought she recognized the man and shouted, "Louis! Louis! Louis!" So still in the bedroom, looking out the window, Maren saw the man raise the axe and with one blow crush Aneth's skull, killing her instantly. The killer then ran back into the house and started pounding again on the bedroom door. And here's Maren trying to get her wounded sister Karen through the window, but she realized that her sister was nearly dead, and her only hope was to climb out of the window and run, leaving her sister behind. So just as she went for the window, the man burst into the room and rushed at her with the axe. And as she was jumping out the window, the axe came down and hit the windowsill so hard that the head of the axe broke off the handle. From outside the window, Maren heard Karen screaming as the intruder finished his ugly, murderous work. Now Maren ran quickly. She picked up the dog and she's running and she's looking for a place to hide. And she said later she was afraid that if she let him down, he would start barking and give away her position. So she just held him. And her first thought was to hide in the hen house, but that was too obvious. So then she ran to the dock thinking that she could escape on this intruder's boat, but there was no boat there. And this led her to believe that he had docked on the other side of the island and then come across to surprise them. She did finally find an isolated section of rock that was kind of hollowed out, and here she is, barefoot in her night clothes, with only her dog to keep her warm, and she hunkered down in this hollowed out piece of rock and waited till dawn. Once morning came, Maren did not know whether or not the killer was still on the island, so she hurried to Malalag, Malaga, Malalag. That's another small island that was connected to the north end of Smutty Nose by a breakwater. So when the tide was low, you could walk across. When the tide was high, there was water there. But anyway, from once she got to Malalag, she could shout to somebody on Appledore Island. Like she couldn't walk there, but it was close enough that her shouting actually drew attention of children playing. And they, of course, went and got adults, and the adults went and rescued Marin. So back in Portsmouth, witnesses all of a sudden see that Lewis is back in town, even though nobody could find him the night before. But he was looking haggard, as if he had not slept all night long. He was seen eating breakfast in his new boarding house, and then he packed his bags and took the 9 a.m. train to Boston. Keep in mind that until now, Lewis has basically been indigent, no cash flow, right? So Marin, who has been rescued by neighboring island family, people, friends, whatever, she told the authorities the story of the murders and accused Lewis of being the killer. So a manhunt ensued naturally, and Lewis was seen in Boston buying a new set of clothes and a new set of boots, and then he got a haircut and he shaved off his beard. And then he went straight back to the North End neighborhood where he had previously lived and was well known. I'm not sure why he did that, but whatever plans he had made were completely undone and overcome by 7 p.m. because Lewis was arrested and on a train headed back to Portsmouth. Now, the welcome wagon in Portsmouth was less welcome and more vigilante. There was a crowd of torches waiting at the train depot when the train came in, and Lewis had to be hurried into a waiting police wagon, and people were throwing rocks all the way. Like there was a gauntlet of people throwing rocks at this wagon all the way from the train station to the police station. And then at the police station, there was another crowd there at the jail, and it took a whole line of police officers with shotguns just to get Lewis into the jail safely. So people were up in arms. They were mad. They were not having any of this murdering people going on in their community. So Lewis was safely locked inside the Portsmouth jail, and the authorities needed to now address the procedural matters, right? The Isle of Shoals are divided between Maine and New Hampshire, and while geographically closer to New Hampshire, like we already mentioned, Smutty Nose was technically part of the state of Maine. So it was determined that legally Lewis had to be extradited to Maine. And that meant he had to again face this rock-throwing crowd. He had to be ushered from the jail into the police wagon, and the police wagon to the train station, and the train station back to Maine. And he actually took a train to South Berwick, Maine. And then he was taken to a more secure prison in Alfred, Maine. So I did not pay attention to the timeline on how long Lewis was in jail, but he was held in jail in Alfred until his trial began. Now, his trial lasted 9 days, which is kind of a long time for the late 1800s or the mid 1800s. Anyway, the circumstantial evidence against him was strong. Before leaving Portsmouth for Massachusetts, he had hidden a bloody shirt in the privy of his boarding house, so in the potty room. The Hotvents had been saving for a new boat, and they had collected or amassed there in the house $15 and some change, and it was hidden in a box that belonged to Marin. Now, that money was gone, was discovered missing during the investigation after the murder. And Lewis had paid $15 for a new suit and boots. And among the coins in Lewis's possession was one of Marin's buttons. So that kind of linked his spending spree to their money, given that their money had been in one of her button boxes. And that change, that button, was found in his pocket when he was arrested. So he was kind of a dummy for keeping that, but whatever. Witnesses also testified that Lewis had, in his lowest, most broke, poor moments, said he would, in fact, commit murder for money. He also knew that John had money in the house because he was hired to help them, get enough business to purchase the second boat. Now, also introduced as evidence was information about the stolen rowboat from Pickering Wharf in Portsmouth. Now, the thief would have had to have rowed for 5 hours. It is March in the northeastern United States, so it would have been cold. And then he would have had to walk 10 miles it was about a 10-mile row. But then the boat was docked on the south side of the island, and there was evidence that whoever had docked the boat there, the boat thief, walked through the snow to the north side of the island, directly to the only occupied house on the island, which was John and Maren Hotvent's home. So whoever stole that boat was the person responsible for at least approaching that house the night of the murders. And then there was Maren's very compelling testimony. She stated without hesitation that the killer was Louis Wagner, and under oath repeated Anthony's last words, which were Louis, 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 as he was chasing her with the axe. So, if that was not enough for you, some of the most damaging evidence actually came from Louis himself. He testified on his own behalf, and he was rambling and incoherent. He claimed that he was working that night baiting trawls for a fishing boat, but he couldn't remember the name of the boat or the name of the captain or even the location on the pier. Then he claimed he went to a saloon, had 2 beers, and then went to sleep outside. It's March. Who sleeps outside? But he could not remember the name of the saloon or where it was located in town. And there was no one, he could provide no one to corroborate his location in either place, either on the pier or in the saloon. So it appeared that he was just saying whatever he could say to get away with murder. So with a lot of circumstantial evidence and the testimony of an eyewitness and victim, there was a trial and then a 55-minute debate among the jury, and after which Louis was found, of course, guilty of premeditated murder. Not just murder, but premeditated murder. Now, that didn't keep Louis down. He had been working on an escape plan since he arrived at Alfred Prison, and he knew that he had to act on it before he was transferred again. So that night, after the verdict had been read, he picked the lock with the end of a wooden toothbrush, put a stool and other items under his blanket to make it appear he was sleeping soundly. Then, during the guard's regular 3 a.m. break, he made his escape. And once he was free, he had no idea where to go. He was afraid to travel through the woods, so he followed the road. Not a smart criminal. Anyway, as he walked down the road, Louis was actually shown some hospitality by a local farmer, but was captured at the farmer's house by a group of vigilantes who then took him back to Alfred Prison, which, good on them, because in those days it would not have been unusual for the vigilantes to just have hung him in a tree. So good on them for taking him back to prison. Louis claimed he wasn't trying to escape, that he just merely needed some exercise. Yeah. So on March 26, 1875, this is like 2 years after the murders, Louis Wagner was hanged alongside a man named True John Gordon, who has also been convicted of murder. And Gordon begged for his life, but Louis, he was silent. He continued up until that point to completely profess his innocence, and he never wavered. And in fact, he claimed that he had converted to Christianity, and he knew that God would not let him be punished by death because he was innocent. Spoiler alert, there was no miraculous divine intervention for Louis that day, and he did, in fact, die by hanging. So in April of that year, April 1876, John actually was able to purchase and launch his new schooner, which he named Mary S. Hontved after his wife. And while he was out at sea, there was a rumor that started appearing in some local newspapers. According to an unnamed source, a dying Swedish woman confessed to killing her sister and her sister-in-law on Smutty Nose Island. Now, this story was quickly retracted. It was completely debunked, but the cruel hoax was a terrible blow to Maren and her husband John and her brother Even, whose sister had died. And FYI, they were from Norway, not Sweden. So that was, that was kind of weird. Anyway, John and Maren had one child, a daughter named Clara, and she was born in Portsmouth in 1877, and Maren was 42 then. So Maren and Clara actually traveled to a village near Oslo in Norway in the early 1880s. Maren Hontved died in Norway on June 24, 1887, more than 10 years after that fraudulent deathbed confession appeared in the newspaper. After surviving harrowing shipwrecks, John Hontved remarried and turned to farming in Portsmouth, where he lived until his death in 1904. Now, there were some people in the 1920s, I think the thing I said 1926, who were trying to revive this case and clear Lewis's name. They were trying to find evidence that Lewis had been framed by a popular family, and there were a couple of theories that kind of started floating around. The first was that Maren was the killer. As the only eyewitness, her testimony was given much weight, but she had more opportunity than a man in a rowboat from Portsmouth, according to these people. An unsubstantiated rumor in the papers claimed that Maren confessed, and the theory was that Maren committed the murders, or the theory that Marion had committed the murders was turned into a book in 1997 called The Weight of Water, which I think I'm going to read now because that sounds interesting. The second theory that floated around was that John, in fact, was the killer, and that Maren's own testimony, Karen thought the man coming through the door was John, and that he was beating her with a chair, and perhaps John did kill Karen and Aneth, and Maren covered for her husband. And for obvious reasons, this would have been very hard to substantiate, except that nobody saw John disappear from Portsmouth, so I don't know how hard that would have been to substantiate. One of the sources I linked down below is called New Hampshire Magazine, and it talks a little bit more about whether Lewis was the real killer or not, whether he was a social deviant or a sociopath, or whether or not he was just happened to be the wrong end of the stick, so to speak. However, those who have looked at the case more objectively, without trying to convince or prove that Lewis was wrongly convicted. So most people who objectively have reviewed the evidence believe that the state of Maine did in fact execute the right man when they sent Lewis Wagner to the gallows for murder. That is not exactly an unsolved story, which, sometimes they're hard to find. Sometimes those unsolved stories are hard to find because, especially in the early days, there were not always a lot of records kept when the murder itself goes unsolved, right? Especially when we're talking the 1800s and there were floods and fires and city halls moved and record keeping changed. And if the person who was the victim or the person who was accused was not prominent enough, there might not be records of those unsolved cases. However, that was a long way of saying, even though this was not technically an unsolved case, I was intrigued by the story for two reasons. Karen claimed it was John. And Karen was sleeping in the kitchen, not in the bedroom with Maren and Aneth. But Karen and Marion were sisters, and Aneth was their sister-in-law. So that's kind of, that's kind of a weird, I don't know. That's kind of weird. So the fact that Karen thought it was John and not Lewis, even though she also would have known Lewis, is kind of weird. And the idea that Lewis would have rowed a boat 10 miles in 5 hours in the March night seems a little bit, and then walked from the south end to the north end of the island. That's a lot to do for $15. I mean, for real, $15 was decent, like way decent money then, but he would have been really tired. I mean, would he have had the physical ability to commit 2 murders after rowing a boat for 10 hours or for 10 miles, 5 hours, and then walking? Now, I didn't look up the dimensions of the island. I imagine if somebody walked it, it had to have been, just a small mile or two. Even I can walk 2 miles, not fast, but, still, if you're trying to do this in the cover of night, you have to do it before the daylight starts, and that means you're moving fast, and I don't know. But all the people believed Marion. All the people agreed that Lewis was kind of a good for nothing. So I don't know. Tell me your opinions. I want to hear what you think about this. So the card is all finished, and this was a very loose watercolor. I didn't spend a lot of time doing any shading. I just wanted to get that out there. But here's a picture of John Hotvet. And I found a picture of his wife, Marion. I could not find pictures of Aneth, Even, or Karen. But I did find a picture of Lewis Wagner. So, yeah. Tell me down below whether you believe how it ended or if you think that maybe Lewis was a scapegoat. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I have a couple of other videos here that I think you would like. I've also added that subscribe button. If you haven't subscribed, I would love it if you did. Give me a thumbs up. If you like the story, if you like the video, let YouTube know that you like this, and I hope you have a really fabulous day.